Good morning, welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. Phillips and Quinn, you know, they're Sunderland's dynamic duo, but we're back together. We've had a couple of weeks off. Joe, how you doing?
I'm all right, mate. Yeah, you?
Yeah, not too bad at all. Before we get stuck into things, obviously We Are Sunderland, the place to be for your red and white news. We're in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. They've been great sponsors to us since we launched. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. Let's get stuck into things. Obviously, we'll start with the developments yesterday that Pascal Jansen's no longer in contention for the Sunderland job. Now, that's something that we had reiterated on We Are Sunderland since, his name came out after being linked. I think it was 2 weeks ago now, that it wasn't clear how, where he was on Sunderland's shortlist. We became aware at the weekend that he's no longer in contention. We'll talk about him a little bit, Joe. I mean, when you look at his CV, worked at Ajax, developed young players, they sell them on for profit and then still have to try and battle out to get in those Champions League places in the Netherlands. I did a piece on We Are Sunderland. It obviously felt like that was he was a sort of character that would fit Sunderland's blueprint. Where we go from here is anyone's guess, but on Jansen, it certainly felt like it would have been a coup. We're obviously not privy to the conversations that have went on between him and the club as to, the reasons why he's no longer in contention, but it certainly felt like it was a name that, would have excited supporters. That was at least the general consensus online.
Yeah, I think so. I just want to know, I'm interested in who you'd think would be Phillips or Quinn out of us two. Going back to the start there. But no, he's one that I think out of the sort of unknown coaches, if you will, who probably does excite the most. I think with Will Still, who obviously there was a long-standing interest in, you could say he's almost untested. I mean, I know Jansen's not been over here as well, but in terms of winning things, likewise Ramage in terms of senior management and things like that, Jansen for me will probably stand out. Just his CV would look more impressive than those two. So purely based on that, you can understand why he would be the one that would draw more attention and more interest from a supporter point of view. But then when you do delve into it, there's quite a lot to unpack and quite a lot to be excited about. You mentioned there the bringing through youth players obviously are going to be a key part of what Sunderland are going to try and do, whoever comes in. And that goes back to when Mike Dodds was asked the question sort of 2 or 3 months ago now, when he said the next coach has got to basically have a developmental background. Which then lends itself to the two that I've just mentioned, particularly Marriage, obviously. But yeah, bringing the players through at that level and being successful as well, albeit in different countries. Yeah, you can absolutely understand why he would be of interest to them. So then for it not to come off, you can then equally understand the frustration that would be then tagged with that. But then it's in that, like what you said, it's we don't exactly know how far down the line they got beyond sort of initial talks between the two. So there's a lot, again, it just seems there's still a lot of spinning plates despite the timescale continuing to move on, doesn't it?
Yeah, we'll talk about Kirill's statement as well, obviously. It felt like, that needed to be made. Whether, there's not a lot you can glean from it at this stage, is that we've gone, I've honestly lost count now. We're well on to 111, maybe 112, 113 days, without a permanent manager. I suppose the club side of things, as I said on, last week's pod, that they'd argue that, Dodds was always going to be in place till the end of the season. So really their time frame only runs from them. But Kirill said that they hope to make an imminent appointment. So again, just to sort of tie it in with Jansen, look, just because Jansen's no longer, in the running doesn't necessarily mean that an appointment isn't imminent or, they're not far down the line with, prospective candidates. Just wondering what you thought of the statement, whether you felt it was needed, where your head is at with this all.
Yeah, I mean, I was advocating a statement, but at the end of the season, I thought that was the time
to
do it. I think I remember I wrote a piece sort of on the final day of the season at the end of the game. I feel as though then would have been a time to do it. You address the season, what went wrong, probably take a little bit more accountability, and then outline what your next steps are in terms of this really being the start of your process, like what you've just mentioned there.
Yeah.
The longer that it's gone on, it's almost felt as though, I don't want to say digging your heels in, but you get to the point where you wonder what good it might have done. Because then you get the statement that comes out on Friday, and now people are expecting something at any time now. I mean, what's your definition of imminent? You know, would it have been over the weekend? Is it today? Is it this week? Is it still 2 weeks left to run? That just opens up a little bit more sort of scope to, you're opening yourself up for a little bit of criticism if something doesn't come anytime soon. And then with news that someone potentially dropping out, that is, without sort of looking at the context of it, that is going to give people perhaps the wrong impression. Whereas you quite rightly point out that Jansen dropping out or not being considered now, that could just be them doing what the statement says in finalising their candidates. You know, there might be one or two, there might be 2 or 3 names in there, and you've got to take 2 of them out. You might be one of them that's going out. So that literally might just be the process of what that statement is detailing. It's just on the face of it. It doesn't feel like that, does it? Because you get that, you're then thinking that something's going to come immediately. And plus, with what happened with Will Still in terms of how that played out, and then you get a name like Jansen, like what we've just said, that would lead itself to a little bit of excitement or a little bit of enthusiasm. And then you see that go, you then wonder what's next, because the names that have been linked, they just whittling down, aren't they? You know, there's sort of Liam Rosenior, he's still available. Cifuentes, he's been linked recently over the last couple of days, a new fresh name. And obviously we've always kind of known that, or it's been suggested that there's names that haven't been related to the public name, but have been sort of shortlisted and spoken to. So it's leading itself to being one of those candidates, really, because, like I say, the names that have been linked, they're very much whittling down now, which is, again, why you can probably understand some of the sort of outpouring of frustration at the news of Jansen dropping out over the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get onto those 2 candidates in a little bit, but that's something that I think, you know, you raise a good point there, is the actual fact that not many candidates, or we're not, you know, the club's done quite a good job of keeping those who they're speaking to quite close to the chest. And when, you know, the likes of Jansen have come out, it's actually tended to be, you know, later down the line. I think the obvious one is Will Still. I think, look, everybody knows that Will Still was, you know, Sunderland's number 1 candidate. I think that's maybe why they waited till the summer, just in case, you know, there was murmurings that he was unhappy at Ream. I think on the face of things now, look, I'm just looking back on that. I don't necessarily think that would have been an appointment that would have, you know, on the face of things, it might have got supporters, you know, uplifted, excited, but, you know, there was commentary made about Ream recruitment plan, and it's you wonder how long that would have taken for there to be a similar conversation at Sunderland. Look, we're under no illusions. We've covered them week in, week out. You know, I just personally feel that you know, there would have been a point where the 2 parties have come together, and I think they would have, you know, locked horns a bit. But it's interesting that, you know, I did a bit on We Are Sunderland again recently over the past couple of days about how the club can't afford to have a similar repeat of that. So they had a repeat of, you know, back in December where they didn't get Still, obviously couldn't afford the compensation fee. They appointed Michael Beale pretty quickly afterwards. Still, I think this is the 2nd or 3rd week since that Still news came out. They can't afford to jump in to another, you know, Michael Beale 2.0 type appointment, can they?
Absolutely not. And they keep reiterating that they learn from the mistakes of that. Yeah. It's, from a supporter's point of view, you know, it's a case of how much rope you want to give them at the minute, because, you know, we've spoken ad nauseum about how wrong the last 6 months have gone on and off the field. So then when things like what have happened over the last 2 weeks with the Still link sort of going cold, and then, you know, Jansen over this weekend, and you're seeing names just coming and going, you can understand why supporters are questioning what's going on, or do they know what's going on?
Yeah.
Equally, like what we've just said there with that statement, you can point, if you take a step back, you can point to saying that they're not just narrowing down their search now, and we are entering the final knock-ins. But I go back to what I say about that statement. You say that if there's an appointment coming imminently, how long is imminently? I mean, if I'm reading that on Friday, you can almost, I might have thought, could come over the weekend. We're now into the next week. At what point does it come this week? And if it's not this week, then when is it coming? Because you've said imminently, and supporters are quite rightly then going to be frustrated by that. So that was my issue with the statement coming when it did. You're almost opening yourself up to create a rod for your own back, because if something happens like what happened with Still, with whoever you're narrowing down now, you then, you know, where do you turn then? And each day passes, you're getting closer to the transfer window opening, you're getting closer to the players returning for pre-season. and then it's becoming a big concern. We spoke about it on the pod over the last couple of weeks. At what point does it become a concern? At what point do we get worried about it? I mean, you're heading towards that territory, aren't you? If you get to the start of pre-season and the players return and there's still no head coach, but realistically, I mean, look at the transfer window. I know that the head coach doesn't have the final say, but we've got contract issues that we're going to come on to and all that.
Yeah.
You want your head coach to be sitting down with these players, notably to try and determine what they're going to do, or if there's a field for them, if there's any hope of keeping some of these players. And then beyond that, like I say, you just want to get your imprint in as soon as you can, and time's running out for that.
Yeah, I mean, Sam's got in touch to say, if they're spoken to as many people as rumoured, plus potential, more candidates. What's that the issue that's putting candidates off, or what makes them unsuitable for the role? Now, again, there's a good point in there. I mean, it's not unnatural for football clubs to speak to loads and loads of candidates, but again, I think the fact is that we are so far into this process now, having been told that there's a plan in place. I think it was before Alex Neil came in that the club said, look, they've got a short list of thousands of candidates. Tom reiterated on the pod last week where you're getting into option B, C, D, E, and F, and you're getting further and further down the list. There are going to be stumbling points with this, and I think we've spoken about, reiterated throughout the course of the season, the recruitment, the youngness or the youthfulness of the squad. There's so many caveats, and it's often difficult when you're immersed in it, isn't it? That Sunderland are still a massive club. They've got such Jack Clark. They've got such good assets. Whether the likes of Clark stays at the club or not, it still should be an attractive proposition for managers to work for. Now, again, we'll get into some of the ins and outs maybe a bit later on, of why it's just so difficult at the moment, isn't it? To even put your finger on it about why are we so far down the line and no closer to an appointment?
Yeah, I mean, the Still stuff was the most telling, wasn't it? The news from his camp suggested, make up with the backroom staff, and then investment. I mean, and the investment line there, I mean, you can argue the toss between them, both of those points, but the investment one is the one that particularly stood out for me, just because we've heard it. We've heard it from everyone else who's been in that seat over the course of the last 18 months. Even Mike Dodds in his interim period, he referenced how the investment might have to change a little bit. We've had ex-players mention it, Lyndon Gooch being the notable one. That is the one that continues to ring true. And this is, I get your point about Still and that sort of the demands that he's perhaps asking for. You saw the fallout from him and the president at Reims, didn't you, when he left there? And I do get that point, what you make there, how there could be perhaps a little bit of a standoff between the two. But again, it's just somebody else to add to that list of people who've been in the position or been in the club, or then potentially coming into the club, who are highlighting the investment strategy. That's the biggest. That would be the biggest concern for me. Now, I get the backroom staff as well. Some would argue equally as important if that's going to be an issue. Michael Beale, he didn't bring anyone in. It was sort of loosely suggested that he could have done at some point down the line. It was a case of just getting him in and then getting his feet under the table. But anyone who's coming in is going to want to bring at least somebody in.
Yeah.
How much do you keep that constraint to one or two people? Or it's going to be difficult for any manager to tempt any manager or head coach in, not giving them some sort of parameters with staff.
Yeah. I think it would be remiss not to mention it, because as much as Mike Dodds is a likable character, having spoken with us at length, throughout the course of the season, again, we've spoken about what he had to put up with last season. It's very strange, isn't it, that you have a club setting like this, where you have a coach who's been tipped to manage the first team, has been given that opportunity now on 3 occasions, to then drop back down. I very rarely, or off the top of my head anyway, I've never experienced a situation where you have a coach put on a pedestal like that. I'm not saying that that's his own doing, by the way, but to be put on a pedestal like that, because then, as we're seeing now, he's under a bit of maybe an unfair spotlight. He's never, as he said, he didn't want to be in the position of being interim head coach, but there they were. So it's a strange dynamic. I've never seen that across football. At least there's nothing that springs to mind where you've got a coach put in that position. Yeah,
it is a little bit on you. I suppose you could maybe say Marti had a little bit of it at Rangers, where he went through the youth ranks and then he was caretaker and then dropped back down and caretaker again, and then he took over a little bit, but it does seem unusual, doesn't it, for that to happen? And again, that can be twofold. It can be a case of the club acknowledging or believing that they've got a really, really good asset in someone like Dodds and then Proctor as well. But then equally, you can see the frustration that if that is a potential stumbling block for bringing new people in, at what point do you? I don't want to say cut your losses, but you almost have to say that, don't you? Because that's the alternative, isn't it? If you want somebody, if you've identified a candidate, but they want to bring in X, Y, and Z as their staff, at what point do you accept that? You either want them or you don't. And if that's why they want to come in or how they want to come in, it's up to you to accommodate that. Now, whether that's by keeping Dodds and Proctor and others in position as well and coming to some sort of compromise. But clearly that, I mean, again, you're basing this off Stills, what came out for his camp, but it does feel as though that's a little bit of an issue as well. So those two things, that the staff and the investment for that to come out, it is a little bit concerned at this stage of proceedings. You know, I get again like how we started the show in terms of saying it's been since the end of the season. This period has been your real sort of narrowing down the search, but really in theory you've had over 100 days to do this, so you should know at that point, even if you're not as sort of rigorous in your search as what you are now, you should know who people are going to potentially want to bring in, and whether that before you've even spoken to them, almost if you've done your homework that way, which they will have done with the data and things like that, they'd have been able to guesstimate which members of staff people want to bring in and whether that's a possibility or not. So it is an issue. It clearly is an issue. And like you say, for then candidates to be dropping out, still obviously the namely one, but you wonder how far down the list you are with candidates now. And that doesn't strike you. And again, you go back to the frustration the fans are feeling at the moment. That doesn't strike you as the sort of succession plan that we've been sort of sold almost, if you will.
I think as well, there's not necessarily, I think this is why, at the start of the show, I mentioned Pascal Jansen and, his blueprint, how he would fit in the model. His comments from his time at AZ Alkmaar were very much, look, I'm aware I'm going to have to sell my better players, but it's how we'll reinvest them, how we'll bring players through. That felt a lot more, to coin a phrase, aligned than maybe others who have been linked, which is why I mentioned the Will Still side of things. To look at those, I think if you look at the broad list of people who have been linked, that doesn't necessarily, you could argue to a degree, look, you've got Marich and Still, who are upcoming coaches, Liam Rosenior as well, but they're all, you're going to get tweaks and slight variations of style of play, but they are still all very different, aren't they?
Yeah, there's barring sort of that progression with young players. Yeah, there is quite a bit of versatility with them. I mean, the Marich one in particular, if you focus on him, that's an interesting one for me, but just simply because he's not managed senior football yet.
Yeah,
you can talk about. I mean, I know there was the Robinson at Chandler links, and that created quite a bit of a social media outpouring. The risk, where would the risk be with someone like Chandler or Robinson? I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, compared to someone like Marich who hasn't managed a senior game. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's a perfectly viable argument to make. So, at least with some of the other candidates, they've managed senior football at sort of top levels across Europe, or in Rosenior's case, or Cifuentes' case in the Championship as well. So, there is a little bit of a change, and I suppose you've got to be open to a difference. If you can outline certain aspects, but then you've got to be open to some things. I mean, you mentioned before with the Alex Neil thing, I think the data drew back sort of 1,000 names, didn't it? And you can use that one as well as a bit of a, you can give them, I mentioned earlier how much rope you give them. You can give them a little bit with that one if you go back as far as then. They identified that Lee Johnson probably wasn't going to get promotion automatically. Highlight that they needed a change, so they went down the data route. Who's then next going to be successful to get them in the playoffs or win the playoffs? Now, granted, it seemed as though Roy Keane was going to get that before Alex Neil did, but then eventually they landed on Alex Neil, and the rest is history, so to speak. So it shows that they're not afraid of making the decisions, and as we've seen with Mowbray as well, sort of end of last season, then when it happened this season. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily follow an outright pattern, does it? Other than that sort of the developmental coach almost that Dodds referred to earlier in the season.
I think interestingly, just again to go back to that, because we've had quite a few managers now in a short tenure. Now, again, to go back to the Alex Neil time of that appointment, I think John Terry came out recently and said that he'd interviewed for the role and thought it went well, but they came back on the experience side of things. So if we bring it up to date, it's very interesting that the likes of Marich, who has, by comparison to some of the names mentioned, has very little or no senior, experience of being a head coach. Of course, he's been at Leeds, he's been at top clubs in Germany. We're at a stage now where I think people are starting to, I don't know, we've gone away from the manager, haven't we? You're now at a head coach where people aren't managing clubs like, for example, Alex Ferguson, they managed above, etc. I think what's interesting now is there has to be scope to go both ways. And I'm just talking about maybe football generally rather than Sunderland here, is managers don't get a lot of time. We've seen here, there's next to no time. Michael Beale, one of the shortest managerial stints in Sunderland's history. Now, again, there were reasons behind that, obviously, and it had to happen. But where we go now is massive. So we'll touch on the Liam Rosenior stuff. He at the time is somebody who, when he left Hull, he's a name that that's why Sunderland have waited to this point, because he was a manager of this nominee after the work he did with Hull. Of course, people are going to look at the ins and outs of that, the finances behind it, did the underachieve, etc. But for me, he's another upcoming head coach. I'd be pretty intrigued to see how he does, because sack from Derby didn't necessarily go well there. Hull, yes, that's a big improvement from when they had Shota Arveladze there. But again, it's another one where the jury's out slightly, isn't it, on Rosenior?
It is a little bit, but I think I think he did a good job at all. I think he'd be. I mean, you quite rightly point out that he was nominated for Manager of the Year. When he took over there, they were a point above relegation. I think he lost 6 games in that first season, stayed them away from relegation, and then they missed out on the playoffs by 3 points. Now, to counteract that, you can say that there's been some good investment there for last season, and some good loan players and the finances available to bring the likes of Fabio Carvalho in, for example. Equally, he was hit with quite a lot of injuries in the turn. I think Liam Delap, for example, he was missing for the majority of the second half of the season. A key player there. Obviously, the African Cup of Nations impacted them as well. If you look at the 2 games between when they played Sunderland over that month period, I think they missed 6 players from the Boxing Day game to when they played in here at the Stadium of Light. So now I know all teams and managers get injuries and things like that, but I don't know. I just think it felt incredibly harsh to me that he got sacked off the back of that. And the fact that he was linked with jobs so swiftly. I mean, I think he was even linked with the Brighton job at one point, which kind of tells you that his stock probably still remains quite high. So you quite rightly point out that Sunderland waiting until the end of the season for someone or an event like that to happen, that it sort of adds a little bit of justification to doing it, because then you can get someone who might not have been available, obviously, when Bale was sacked in February. It's interesting, though, I think, if he is someone that they're considering, which, understand that there's talks have taken place, but if he's not been appointed yet, a month on from being sacked by Hull, you wonder what the stumbling block is there. We've just been speaking about investment in backroom staff. It could work the other way as well. It could work in terms of the club then, interviewing someone and then not fancying someone, for example. So that would be my only hesitation now at the minute, is why would someone like him not have been appointed yet with being out of work? Similar to what we said about Heckenbottom right the way back at the start of the process. Someone like them who hasn't been in work, aren't appointed yet. Why is that? What's the underlying reason for that? So that would be my only hesitation with someone like Senior at the moment. But I think someone would be quite right to look at him, and I think I think I'm interested to see where he does end up, whether it's here or elsewhere, and the job that he can go on and do, because I think he was a little bit unfair at all. Me being perfect.
I mean, some managers interview well, some managers interview poorly, isn't it?
So any job, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, another name, the QPR boss, I'm probably butchering this pronunciation, Marti Cifuentes. What's interesting about that is he's the first manager from, who's been linked in the current process, who, all right, Danny Rowe, but I don't think that the figures behind that were ever going to be realistic when you see Chansiri slapped 5 million on him and a reported 10 million on the rest of his staff. But Sunderland would have to pay compensation. Now, that would be very interesting. It'd be very indicative of where they're going to go. Now, again, so much rides on this head coach appointment. We've spoken about with loads at length. But if they were to pay compensation for somebody like Cifuentes, that would not open up a new can of worms, but it would certainly add a new dynamic into the mix, and it would offer a better insight as to where they want to go, because QPR have paid compensation for him from Hammarby, I think it was. So on him, I mean, what have you made of the links to him? Because they're interesting. When QPR weren't great when they came up here, but he did a good job down there, and he steered them away from relegation, having looked like one of the favourites to go down last year.
Well, I mean, if you look when he took over from Gareth Ainsworth, it almost looked like a thankless task, didn't it?
Yeah.
They rarely won a game, to be honest, under Ainsworth. So he did go in and do a good job. Obviously, you think of the Leeds game where they officially stayed up right at the end of the season, the 4-0. But yeah, again, we've spoken about a different route and how they don't map out. This one feels a little bit left field, doesn't it? I think. But the compensation thing's the key aspect here for me. If they haven't paid compensation yet, what makes you? I almost question whether they do it now. I mean, there's still one. Again, you go back to December when Still was first linked. Obviously, it could be different fees. We don't know the length of Cifuentes' contract at Loftus Road. But I mean, there's admirers with them as well. I think Burnley are linked with them as well. So you're facing competition, but the compensation thing, it does feel like a stumbling block at the moment compared to where we've been before with the club in the search. I haven't necessarily done as much research on Cifuentes in terms of style of play and things like that, but if you link him with some of the names that we've had, like a Still or a Marich or a Jansen, for example, it just feels a little bit left field, doesn't it? I know he's got experience in a number of countries, Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, I think, but I don't know. It's a strange one to come out, and again, it supports the claims that there's been talks with candidates who have been unnamed at this point. Like you said, the club have done a pretty good job of keeping that sort of locked away for the majority of the search. But I don't know. Can you see them paying compensation for someone?
Now, I don't. Again, I'm not privy to any conversations that have been going on, but I think if the club were to make a statement, and again, the piece I did spoke about, they need to build a rapport, they need to make a statement, etc., with the new head coach. You have to get fans back on side. We haven't seen it yet, but part of me thinks, will they roll the dice? Will they take a gamble on doing that? Because that would be better, or at least some would view it as an improvement on, you've paid to get somebody out of a job. There's a sign of ambition, rather than appointing somebody who has been out of work. Do I think they'll do it? The Sunderland Football Club, I mean, you could say one thing and then no, the opposite would happen. You never know really, truly, until it's a done deal. But I certainly think, like you say, it's an interesting one. I don't necessarily know, like you've said, a lot about them apart from when they came up to the stadium like earlier this year. It was a terrible game. Look, you can't get away from that. It was terrible. But from their point of view, they would have been happy with a point. I think they've got a lot older squad than what Sunderland have. It brings us back to, the uncertainty, or at least you don't know, the size of Sunderland's budget, where you're led to believe that it's one of the smaller ones in the division. But again, we'll move it on a bit, because it comes into this summer with players staying or going. If you get a big summer sale and that's reinvested back in to the squad the right way, what promises are being made to these head coaches? What talk of budgets are you having? So much depends on. It's just a massive, massive next couple of weeks and months for the football club. Now, again, the Rigg one, the Chris Rigg stuff that came out lately is pretty interesting. I mean, Sunderland want to keep him, it's obvious, but the interest in him, people would have to pay compensation for him. We're at it feels like tipping point, but I feel like that's where we're at least at present day.
Yeah, it does feel like that. I mean, Rigg and Clark are the two, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're the two players that you would want a new head coach to sit down with and map out how things are going to go. And from their point of view, you can understand like why there will be potentially some frustration there. If the club are wanting to keep them, they want to know who's going to be their manager, their head coach for next season. And at the moment, there isn't any of that. And then it just goes into lends itself to been on the back foot at the start of the transfer window, which it feels like Sunderland can't do this summer. You want to go in head on when this window opens over the next week and start getting things done. But any potential new recruits, even beyond trying to get people to sign new deals in Rigg's case, or trying to convince Clark to possibly stay, if you're a potential new player, are you going to come if you don't know who your head coach is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, that's it, isn't it? Even towards the end of the season, there wasn't, in comparison to years gone by, that there hasn't been, of course, there's been the odd name linked with Sunderland, as there is with every club, but there hasn't been, concrete sort of interest or suggestions of any players of which route they're going to go down this summer. I mean, you've had the Divan Mubama one last week, West Ham obviously now want to keep him, but there hasn't been any. This is what I mean about the club have had to come out and either, they've reiterated their ambition, but the head coach appointment will give such an indication as to what direction they want to go in. Then you move on to the first couple of transfers, right? Okay, that it can swing the pendulum either way. And I feel like Sunderland are not at a dangerous point, but they're at a really important stage of they have to get this right. They have to get this right.
It goes back to the penultimate week. I think I asked Mike Dodds, does it need a statement ahead of that final game?
Yeah.
And his main quote out of it was sort of, I don't think it needs a statement, but actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
And that was, 6-7 weeks ago, or however long ago it was. And like I said, we're at the point where the transfer window is going to open. Players coming back in, 2 or 3 weeks' time? At the moment, the actions aren't speaking very much, are they? Well, that's how it feels, and you can totally understand why supporters would be frustrated at what's happening. Now, obviously, in house, it might be a little bit different. They might not be as sort of, what's the correct phrase here, alarmed or worried about things. But, I mean, the pressure is only going to grow. And that goes back to the head coach as well. Whoever comes in now, it almost feels as though they're starting a little bit snookered almost, because if they get off to a slow start, they're under immense pressure. I know you probably are anyway, but just given how things have gone, the frustrations above them, it's almost beyond their, it wouldn't necessarily be their fault, but yet it would obviously land on their head. Whoever comes in, a slow start will be, you don't even want to think about it, do you? If that could, but that is kind of where there's almost an unnecessary pressure on the head coach coming in, just because of how long it's taken at this point, and then the issues that we talk about now that need to be sorted, which realistically, if we're being honest, they're probably not going to be sorted straight away, because a new head coach needs to get in and speak to the squad, get his feet under the table, get used to the new place or whatever, all the things that we've spoken about before. Whereas really you wanted this in place now for these key discussions to happen now, so they can happen when they need to be done. I think Chris Rigg can sign his first pro deal in a week or 8 days' time. There's no head coach there to talk to him. You know what I mean? So it's quite rightly, you can quite rightly understand why there's frustration there, and a little, more than a little bit of concern with things at the moment. And then again, it goes back to this imminently. If something doesn't happen soon, how soon is it going to be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect point to sort of draw things to an end with tying everything together. We Are Sunderland, the place to be for your red and white news. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. If you haven't yet, head over to We Are Sunderland. You subscribe for just £1 for 6 months worth of content. We do have a competition going over there at the minute to win a signed Sunderland shirt from last season, so that's a good little prize to win. Thanks again for joining us this morning, and we'll catch you later in the week.